sender receiver widgets. But in addition to that, you can have a single sender, like this heat map, sending its object. By the way, that's what the blue indicates, as we see here in the legend. We can configure the heat map, which is our sender, to send its data to multiple receivers. In this example here, by following the blue lines, you can see that our heat map sender widget is sending the object that gets selected to both the object relationship widget and the metric chart widget. Again, just following the blue lines there. So we have one sender in this example, the heat map, but two receivers, object relationship and metric chart. Additionally, this screenshot also shows you another type of widget interaction that you can set up, in which instead of sending an object, we'll send a metric. So orange here in the diagram indicates metrics. Instead of, or in addition to sending objects, you can send metrics from a sender widget to one or more receiver widgets by dragging and dropping between the orange icons. So again, by adding a multitude of interactions, you can make the dashboard very interactive for your users. Another technique that you can use in your dashboards is called dashboard navigation. Dashboard navigation is like widget interactions. It's just taken to another level. As you know already, widget interactions involve sending objects or metrics between widgets in the same dashboard. Widget interactions take place within one dashboard. Dashboard navigation is the same idea, but instead of sending the object or metric from one widget to another widget in the same dashboard, with dashboard navigation, we will send an object or a metric from a widget in one dashboard to another widget in another dashboard. If you would like to set up dashboard navigation, you'll first start by creating your dashboard. You'll drag and drop in your widget. So in this particular dashboard called New Dashboard, we have this widget, and this widget. So we design our first dashboard. And if we want to, we can set up widget interactions within that dashboard, which we can see here, here, and here. So you set up your first dashboard. Once you have your first dashboard set up, you then select another dashboard. Again, this could be any of the other dashboards. When you select that dashboard, the other dashboard will be displayed on the right. And as you can see, both the original dashboard on the left and the new dashboard, the other dashboard on the right, have the same icons. They have the same meaning. Again, we've got the sender icon, the receiver icon. We have blue icons. We have orange icons. So the icons mean exactly what they did before. But now that you have two dashboards side by side, you can drag and drop to create connections between the dashboards. For example, in our screenshot here, you can see that in our dashboard called New Dashboard, we have configured the heat map widget to send whatever object is selected, not just through a widget interaction to this widget and another widget interaction to this widget. We have additionally set up a dashboard navigation between the two dashboards. So in this specific case, the dashboard navigation is causing whatever object is selected in the heat map to be sent into the dashboard called Troubleshoot a VM, specifically into the widget called Search for, and the name's truncated here so I can't see it, but the top leftmost widget in the second dashboard is our receiving widget. Again, this is called a dashboard navigation. From the end user's perspective, the way they do dashboard navigations is different from how they do a widget interaction. When a user wants to do a widget interaction, they go into a dashboard, they go to a sender widget, and they double-click something, such as a virtual machine object. On the other hand, in order to perform a dashboard navigation, the user has to do something different. To do a dashboard navigation, the user is going to click on that eyeball icon that I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson. When you a user first sees a dashboard and all the widgets, they'll see the title bar, but until they click that eyeball icon, they won't see this line, this bar. Clicking the eyeball icon shows this bar. This bar allows the user to do a variety of things, but for our purposes here, it's this first button that we want to draw your attention to. With this button, you can do several different things. You can launch the vSphere web client if you choose to, but for our purposes here in this discussion, the crucial thing that this button allows you to do is to go into the navigate option. That will bring up a submenu that will list all of the other dashboards that we can navigate to. So this is not a list of all the dashboards, but rather just the dashboards to which we can do a dashboard navigation. So again, from the end user's perspective, a widget interaction is just double click, but for dashboard navigation, they need to click the eyeball icon, click the menu button, go to navigate, and select the dashboard that they want to navigate to. Earlier, when we first introduced how to create dashboards, I showed you what you would do if you were adding widgets. Again, by default, this slider will be slid to the right, and the list on the bottom of the screen will be a list of widgets. But as you can see, that slider can be slid to the left, which says, instead of displaying widgets down here, I would like to see a list of views. Now, views, as you'll recall, is a topic that we've discussed earlier in this course. Views are reusable components that you can use in reports and dashboards. Those views allow us to display information in a variety of different ways. Earlier, we talked about how we could display a view using a list view, or a summary view, or a trend view, or distribution view. Distribution view is pie charts, donut charts, and bar charts. Additionally, we learned about two more view types called text, which we can see here in this screenshot, and truncated from the screenshot, there's one more type of view, which is the image view. So just like widgets, you can drag and drop these views into your canvas area. And you can, if you choose to, you can combine together in a single dashboard. You can combine together views and widgets. They interoperate just fine. So if you want to add in a view, your first step is to slide the slider to the left to say, I want to see views. Then you'll drag your view into the canvas, and then there's still more work to do. So let's take a look at the next slide. It's not enough to simply drag the view into the canvas area, because those six view choices that we saw in the previous slide, what were they? List, summary, trend, distribution, text, and image. Those are not the actual views themselves. Those are just types of views. When you drag one of those types of views into your canvas area, you still have to tell us exactly which view you want to display. So to do that, you take your new view that you just dragged into your dashboard canvas, you click the pencil icon to edit that view, and in the settings, you need to pick exactly which view you want to display. Again, going back to that previous slide, these, strictly speaking, are not the actual views that you're dragging and dropping in. These are types of views. You need to drag in one of these types of views and then select exactly which view you want displayed. In this video, we're going to learn an advanced technique that you can use in your custom dashboards. This technique involves something known as metric configuration files. Now, before I show you how to create the metric configuration files, let's zoom out and look at the overall picture. There are a collection of widgets. You can see the list of them here. So scoreboard widget, metric chart, and so forth. These widgets, in addition to the usual settings that widgets have, these widgets allow you to set up a metric configuration file to describe how you want these widgets to behave. Let's take a look, as an example, at the scoreboard widget, which we can see over here. So let's zoom in. This scoreboard widget displays information as a collection of tiles. So here's a tile, Here's another tile. Each of these rectangles is a tile. Those tiles will display whatever information we tell it to display. And that's what we're doing through the metric configuration file. The metric configuration file is saying how many tiles we want to display. It's saying at what numerical thresholds these icons should change color. The metric configuration file is saying what the label should be. The metric configuration file is saying, if appropriate, what unit label to specify. All that specified through a metric configuration file. So we're going to show you how to set that up, but these 6 different widgets that you see here behave just like widgets we've seen before. So in addition to what I'm about to teach you here with metric configuration files, these 6 widgets still act like the other widgets. For instance, in this screenshot here, you can see we've set up our object score widget to be a receiver of a widget interaction that's coming from this object list displayed up above. So everything that we've told you before about widgets is true of these 6 widgets too, but these 6 widgets additionally support metric configuration files. To use a metric configuration file, you first have to create the metric configuration file. So let's see how you do that. Let's take a look at how to create a metric configuration file. As you can see here, these metric configuration files are XML files. If helpful, you might want to go check out a tutorial on XML. But even without being an expert in XML, you can create these files pretty easily. To do so, you're going to go to Configure, Configuration, Metric Configuration, which is going to bring up the interface that you see here in the screenshot. When you're in that interface, there are a number of different folders, including one called Resource Kind Metric, which is not shown here in this screenshot, but that's where all of these XML files reside, including there's one called sample scoreboard.xml. So what we can do is either modifying the files that are here, or if you click the Add button, you can create a new XML file. So let's take a look at the sample scoreboard XML file and see how these files are structured. The first line of your metric configuration file will begin with this declaration. Essentially what this first line is saying is this is an XML file. Then your file will be divided up into different sections. The first section that you see starting here begins adapter kinds, and down below it ends with adapter kinds. By the way, don't mistake adapter kinds, there's one of those, with adapter kind, singular. What adapter kind is indicating is that the following information, until we get all the way down to the closing adapter kind, all this information in between is dealing with objects that are being monitored by the vCenter data adapter. The nickname for the vCenter data adapter is VMware. Each data adapter has its own name. So if you wanted your scoreboard to display objects from being monitored by multiple data adapters, you would need an adapter kind section for each of them. And when you start the next one, you'd need to look up and replace this here with the name of the data adapter in question. But let's just focus on this vCenter data adapter. So after the resource kind, the next thing you'll see is, after adapter kind, the next thing you'll see is resource kind. So what this section from here to here is describing are objects that are host related. So every one of these entries, this here is a metric, this is a metric, this is a metric. Those metrics are all related to hosts, specifically ESXi hosts. So in each metric line, we see metric, attribute key. For our purposes, attribute and metric mean the same thing. This is the metric that we want the scoreboard to display. This is the label we want the tile to say in the scoreboard. The unit measurement, again, this could be percent, could be megahertz, could be gigabytes. And then the following, yellow, orange, red, allow you to set the thresholds at which the scoreboard tile icon changes colors. Now, unlike adapter kinds, which ends with /adapter kinds, unlike adapter kinds, resource kind, and so forth, metric is using a different way of closing this section. Instead of having /metric to end this metric section, you can put a / at the end of any of these. Again, you know that from the XML tutorial that you've already been through. But this is the basic format of a XML file that's used as a metric configuration file. Once you've set this up, you can then go add any of the specialized widgets that we saw before, such as the scoreboard widget. You can add that widget to your dashboard canvas, edit that widget, and one of the settings in the scoreboard widget allows you to point to the metric configuration file that you want to use. So again, this is one example. You can take a look at all the examples in the metric configuration editor to see different ways of using these metric configuration files to your advantage. Now it's time to take what we learned and put it into practice. To do so, we have 2 labs. In this first lab, you're going to create a variety of dashboards, including dashboards that utilize widget interaction. And then in the second lab, you're going to work with one of those metric configuration files in order to create a custom scoreboard widget. So let's go do the labs. When you're done, join me in the next video and we'll wrap up this lesson. Now that you're done with the lab, let's do a quick recap of the lesson. So we talked about custom dashboards and specifically how to create custom dashboards. We saw that custom dashboards are created out of widgets and or views. We saw how to edit the settings for widgets and views. We saw how to use those widgets and views combined together to create a custom dashboard. We talked about how to do widget interactions along with dashboard navigation, and we ended this lesson with a discussion about metric configuration files and how you can use those to enhance your scoreboard widgets and other such widgets. Now that we know how to create dashboards, let's take a look at the various management tasks that you perform on dashboards. In this lesson, we'll be talking about what's known as summary dashboards and how you can change them. We'll talk about how you can organize your dashboards. And additionally, we're going to talk about a number of different ways that you can share your dashboards with other users. To manage dashboards, you'll log into the product UI. Then you'll go to Visualize, Dashboards, and choose Manage. That will take you to the Manage screen where you will see your dashboards, but additionally, the ... button allows you to perform various management tasks on those dashboards. So as you can see, one of the things you can do is to import dashboards. I'll show you here shortly how to export a dashboard. You can choose to auto-rotate dashboards. What that allows you to do is to specify a number of different dashboards and to cycle through them. So show one dashboard, then the next dashboard, then the next dashboard. You get to pick which dashboards, you get to pick the order, and you get to pick the amount of delay in between switching from one dashboard to another. Manage summary dashboards and manage dashboard folders are management tasks that we're going to discuss here in a few moments, so I'll leave those for right now. Instead, what we want to do for right now is talk about how you can share your dashboards. So one way to share your dashboards is to select this option from the drop-down menu. There is another way to get into dashboard sharing. I'll show you how to do that in the following slide. Another way to share dashboards is if you're actually looking at a dashboard. For example, here we're looking at the Assess Cost dashboard. You can go over to the button here, click it, and it will pop up a window, which you can see here. And additionally, you can see that it gives you 5 different choices. We're going to talk about each of these. Each allows you to share dashboards, but let's look first at URL. What this option allows you to do is to share your dashboard with one or more people by supplying them with a URL. So as you can see here, the URL will be generated and displayed right here. You can copy that URL and send it to somebody however you want. For example, you could email it to them, or you could recite it to them. However you want to send the URL, you've got a URL. That URL will last as long as you specify here. So if you'd like to put a timeout on that dashboard, or access to the dashboard, I should say, you can specify an expiry date here. And then down on the bottom, you'll see a list of all the dashboard links that you previously created. And if you want to, you can select a link and delete it. So again, sharing your dashboard by providing a URL is one technique. Another technique for sharing your dashboard is the email option. Now, much of this works the same as it did for URL sharing. So once again, we have a link expiry. But here, since it's email, you're going to give us the email address that you want to send the link to. And in order to send that email, you need to have already configured vRealize operations to be able to send email, which you've learned how to do previously by creating an outbound plugin instance. We first learned about those when we were talking about alert notifications. So this is the same concept as before. You would need to create a connection to your email server by creating an SMTP instance. If you've already done that, you can just select it from this list. If you have not yet configured a connection to your email server, you would click Configure, and it will bring up the same interface that we saw previously. Again, when we talked about alert notifications, we talked about how to configure these outbound instances. So now you know how to share a dashboard either by sending a URL, or we will email the link to a person. But as you can see, there are 3 additional techniques. Let's take a look at those. A third way that you can share your dashboard is to allow somebody to embed it into their web page. So with this option, again, you can send expiration, but the core portion of this here is this HTML code that we automatically generate for you. You can select this code, copy it, and send it to your colleague who does web page design. They can embed this HTML code into their existing web page. So now we know 3 different ways of sharing dashboards. Next up, we're going to talk about how to share dashboards with entire groups of users. Sharing a dashboard with the groups of users is fairly straightforward. You just go to Groups, select the group, click Include, and we'll give everybody access to that dashboard. By default, however, there is only one group called Everyone. Presumably, if you're using groups, you have already configured groups someplace, such as in Active Directory. We can use those groups for sharing your dashboards. But first, you'd have to learn how to connect vRealize operations to Active Directory, which is a topic for an upcoming module. The final technique that we're going to show you for sharing your dashboard is to export it. When you choose Export and click Go, it will allow you to save your dashboard as a .zip file that you can send to somebody else. They can import. A few slides ago, we saw where to choose Import. They can import your .zip file into their vRealize operations deployment. So again, importing and exporting allows you to share your dashboards across completely separate vRealize operations deployments. Now that we know 5 different ways that you can share your dashboards, let's take a look at some related concepts. Now, another thing that you can do with dashboards is transfer the ownership of the dashboard from you to somebody else. To do so, you go to the Manage Dashboard screen. You select the checkbox for the particular dashboard that you want to share. You can't see it here, but there's a ... menu right about here, which brings up this menu, and the Change Ownership option is where you would go to change the ownership. Right now, this particular dashboard is owned by admin, but when we choose to change ownership, we can change the owner to any user that vRealize operations is aware of. So again, that's not sharing a dashboard, but rather changing who the owner is. Next, we'll talk about how to modify the dashboard displayed on the Summary tab. But what is the Summary tab that we're referring to? If you take a look at the screenshot here, what we're looking at is the object browser. And in the object browser, we happen to be looking at a virtual machine called Web-01. Now, virtual machines and other objects all can be displayed through the object browser. When you look at an object, any object, not just virtual machines, but any object in the object browser, there will be multiple tabs. There's an events tab, a compliance tab, capacity, metrics, alerts, and the first tab, the default tab, is called the summary tab. The summary tab displays a dashboard that looks like this by default. But what you can do is change which dashboard is displayed on the summary tab on a per object type basis. So if you have a different dashboard, if you don't want to see this dashboard for virtual machines, but want to see another dashboard displayed when the user's on the summary tab, you can change that. And that's what we're going to show you how to do next. If you'd like to change the dashboard displayed on the summary tab for a particular type of object, what you'll do is go into Manage Dashboards, go to the Actions menu, and choose Manage Summary Dashboards. In there, you will see a list of different object types. If I want to change the Summary tab dashboard for virtual machines, I would select Virtual Machine. I'd click this button, and that will pop up the window that we see over here, which is a list of all the dashboards. All you have to do here is select the dashboard that you do want to display for virtual machines, and then simply click OK. Again, this is the process for changing the Summary tab so that it displays a different dashboard than the default for a particular type of object. vRealize Operations has a mechanism built in called dashboard groups. Some people call these folders, but whatever you call them, you've actually seen these before. When you look at the list of dashboards that are available in vRealize Operations, you'll notice that they have been lumped together into different categories, such as there are dashboards for availability, there are AWS dashboards, there are capacity dashboards. Each of these different categories is called a dashboard group. So whether you want to call them categories or folders or dashboard groups, these provide you with the ability to organize your dashboards into meaningful groupings. So if you want to create a dashboard group that will store whichever dashboards you want, you need to follow the procedure that we're going to show you. The procedure for creating dashboard groups is to go to the dashboard management screen, click ... and depending upon what version of vRealize Operations you're using, they'll either be called dashboard groups or dashboard folders. Either way, you select that option. That will bring up another window that's going to display your existing dashboard groups, or in the case of this screenshot, it's calling them folders. And all you have to do is click New Folder to create a new folder, give it a name, and then you can drag and drop whichever dashboards you want into that dashboard group. So as you can see, creating these dashboard groups is quite straightforward. Earlier in this lesson, we showed you 5 different ways that you could share your dashboard with your colleagues. In addition to those, there is an older interface that still exists. You can see a screenshot of it here in the slide. But this older technique allows you to share dashboards with groups of users. Again, whether you're using the newer technique that we showed you earlier or you're using this older technique, if you want to share your dashboards with specific groups of users, you first need to configure vRealize Operations to know about those groups. For example, those groups might exist in Active Directory, in which case you would have to teach vRealize Operations how to connect to Active Directory. That's a topic for later on in this course. Now it's time to put into practice what we learned in this lesson. We have a pair of labs for you to work on. In this first lab, you're going to once again work with creating dashboards, but this time it's going to be a dashboard with dashboard navigation built in. And in the other lab, you will be working with managing dashboards. So let's go do the labs, and when you're done, come back to the next video and we'll recap the lesson. Now that you're done with the lab, let's do a quick recap of this lesson. In this lesson, we talked about the Summary tab and how you could change the dashboard for the Summary tab for any type of object in vRealize operations. Additionally, we talked about how to create dashboard groups, or sometimes called folders. And at the very beginning of our lesson, we talked about 5 different ways that you can share your dashboards with other users. That brings us to the end of this module. If you'd like to, you can hit pause and review these key points. But when you're done, jump to the next video and we'll start the next module. In this module, we're going to learn how to create super metrics. What super metrics allow you to do is to take existing performance metrics and combine them together using a formula you define to create, in effect, a new metric. In this lesson, we are going to discuss how to design and create super metrics. We'll talk about how to create super metrics, we'll talk about how to associate super metrics with objects, and additionally, we'll talk about how to enable your super metrics in your policies. A super metric allows you to write a formula that takes existing performance metrics and combines them together in a new and meaningful way. Again, super metrics, in effect, allow you to create your own metric. When you create super metrics, you can create them using the metrics of any type of object. We're going to be giving a lot of vSphere object examples, but super metrics can work for non-vSphere objects too. Super metrics are useful in situations where you're trying to track multiple metrics, but you'd rather just see a single value. You can use super metrics for a slew of different possible combinations, including the example we give here. Perhaps you want a super metric that's going to track the average CPU utilization of virtual machines across an entire cluster. Again, there's a performance metric to see the CPU usage on an individual virtual machine, but with the super metric, we can take that up to a higher level and say, give me that value, an average of that value for all the VMs across my entire cluster. Super metrics are easier to work with. It's easier to work with a single metric than it is multiple. Again, they offer a more comprehensive view. If you can have a single metric instead of having to look at a bunch of different performance metrics, again, that's going to make your life easier. Additionally, super metrics can be useful for investigative and forensic purposes, but we need to first learn how to design these super metrics before we can create them. Before you can create your super metrics, or even before you start to design them, you need to understand a bit of terminology. When working with super metrics, you need to distinguish in your mind the difference between working with a single object versus a multitude of objects. When working with a single object, as we've been doing so far in class, we've been working with a single object like a virtual machine, or a single object such as a host. When you work with a single object, we refer to that as an object, and we refer to the data that we work with that object as metrics. Again, you're familiar with the objects, you're familiar with metrics, nothing new in that terminology. But when we start working with a multitude of objects, in the world of supermetrics, we refer to a multitude of objects as an object type. For example, virtual machines is an object type. Host systems is an object type. Clusters is an object type. Again, it's a multitude of the same type of object. Additionally, when we're working with a multitude of objects, when we're working with an object type, we refer to the pieces of data that we're going to work with as an attribute type. We'll explain in just a moment what we mean by that. But key concept here, when working with a multitude of objects, that's an object type, and the data that we get from those is known as an attribute type. When you're working with a single object, then we collect metrics. So for example, virtual machines have a variety of performance metrics, including the CPU usage percentage metric, and the active memory metric, and the write IOs per second metric. Again, we have those metrics and more for the object type called virtual machine. For the object type called host system, we have its own metrics. Again, CPU usage percentage, memory ballooning, and data store latency. Now, do notice, by the way, sometimes different types of objects have a metric with the same name. So don't confuse, for example, the VM CPU usage percentage with the host CPU usage percentage. Same name, but those are different metrics on two different objects. A few slides ago, we pointed out that when you're working with a multitude of objects, we refer to that as an object type. Again, virtual machines is an object type. Host systems is an object type. Clusters is an object type. And additionally, we mentioned that when you're working with an object type, the data that we work with in that case is known as an attribute type. Now, what an attribute type is, in effect, it's a collection or an array of performance metrics. So an attribute type is the same metric collected for a multitude of objects. For example, if we are working with the object type virtual machine, and we say that we want the attribute type called CPU usage, we're not going to get back a single value for CPU usage. Rather, we're going to get back an array of those values, one value for each of the individual objects that we're looking at. So again, it's just a little bit different terminology here when you're working with a multitude of objects. Oftentimes, when you create a super metric, you're doing so because there's no performance metric supplied by VMware to provide you the information that you want. Again, there's lots of performance metrics, but there may not be a performance metric for exactly what you need. For example, imagine if you wanted to have a super metric to help you in deploying your data stores and deciding how to configure their RAID characteristics. Some data stores will be RAID 1+0, other data stores will be RAID 5, and as storage folks know, picking the right RAID level for the types of workloads that are in a data store can make a significant difference in the performance of that data store. In the world of vRealize operations, there are existing performance metrics. For example, there's a performance metric that will tell you how many read operations we're doing per second. There's another performance metric that tells you how many write IOs we're doing per second. But maybe what we want to know, instead of the quantity of reads per second or the quantity of writes per second, maybe what we want to know is the percentage of the IOs that are reads or the percentage of the IOs that are writes. Now, there is no such performance metric. We have a performance metric to tell us the quantity of reads. We have another performance metric to tell us the quantity of writes, but no performance metric to give us the percentage of IOs that are reads. So what we can do is take the existing performance metrics, and using a formula that we write, we can create a new super metric. Consider the following example. If we wanted to calculate the percentage of our IOs that are reads, again, there's no performance metric that does that, but what we can do is create a formula that says that the value of that super metric, that's what we're creating, is equal to some formula. So let's take a look at this formula. In order to understand this formula, we'll talk later on what the word this means in the formula that we're looking at. But for right now, just ignore the word this. And let's break up this formula into multiple parts. So in this part of our formula, we're saying take the number of read operations that we're doing per second, and that's an existing performance metric, and add to that the number of write operations we're doing. Again, we have a performance metric to do that. So by taking these two existing performance metrics and adding them together, we're going to get a new value. In this specific case, what we're going to get is the total IOs that we're doing per second. The total IOs per second. Now, that's not quite what we want our super metric to do. What we want our super metric to do is to tell us the percentage of our IOs that are reads. Well, armed with that total, we can do some simple math with our formula to figure out the percentage that's reads. If we take the number of reads that we're doing per second. Again, that's an existing performance metric. And we take that total that we just calculated by adding those two values together. If we divide the number of reads by the total IOs that we're doing per second, that will give us our read percentage. Actually, not quite. This much of the formula would yield results such as 75 or 23, 0.75 or 0.23 or 0.84, which doesn't quite look like the percentage that we want. I don't want it to say 0.75, I would want it to say 75%. I don't want it to say 0.23, I want it to say 23%. In other words, we need to multiply these decimal values by 100, which is what we're doing here, to turn things such as 0.75 so it looks more like the percentage that we were trying to calculate. So again, key points, this is just an example. We could come up with an infinite number of other examples. But the point of this example is we're taking existing performance metrics and using a formula that we write, we're creating a new super metric. Again, this is our first example, but let's look at some more. One of the things that you can do with your super metrics is called a roll-up. Now, in order to understand a roll-up, let's take this diagram and break it down into some simpler parts. Imagine we have some hosts. Let's call this host number 1, and this will be host number 2. And perhaps we have more than 2, but there's only so much room on this slide. So let's say we have 2 hosts. And let's say that we write a super metric that's going to calculate how much disk space is free in a host. So again, we could create a super metric that takes the quantity of disk space that's free in this data store plus the quantity of disk space free in this data store plus this data store plus this data store. Again, using our addition, we can add up the free space for each of the individual data stores and collectively come up with the amount of free space for this host. Now, one of the things that defining a super metric does is it allows us to use that same formula on lots of different objects. So again, a moment ago, we just said, let's use that formula to calculate the free space for host 1, but we could use that same super metric for host 2. When we did the super metric on host 1, we found out, let's see, 200 plus 250 plus 250 plus 500 is 1.2 terabytes of free disk space in host number 1. So our super metric says that host 1 has 1.2 terabytes. Using that same super metric on host 2, we discover 100 plus 120 plus 380 is 600 gigabytes. And we could leave it at that. We could just say, I want to know how much free disk space there is on each of these individual hosts. But with a roll-up super metric, what we can do is take the values that we're getting for the individual hosts and add them together to come up with a grand total of how much free space there is in our entire cluster. Or if we want to, we can roll up higher than that. We could say, I want to know the free disk space on the hosts in our data center. Or I could do it one level higher than that and say, I want that same value calculated for all the hosts that are part of my vCenter server. So again, roll-up supermetrics is an option that's available to you. They are actually frequently used in the world of supermetrics, and you are going to learn in the next slide a very crucial piece of information that you need to understand if you want to create these roll-up supermetrics. When you create supermetrics that are doing roll-ups, it's essential to understand the concept of depth. Imagine, if you will, we want to create a supermetric that's going to go look up some piece of information, some performance metric for virtual machines. So we've got a collection of virtual machines here. Some are on one host, others on another host, and those two hosts are in a cluster. So what we could do is we could say the performance metrics we're going to work with are defined down on the VMs, but we could apply the supermetric at a higher level. So even though the performance metrics are coming from the virtual machines, we could say, let's apply the supermetric at the cluster level. Well, if you are hanging out at the cluster level and you want to see what's going on with the virtual machines, you're going to have to take 1, 2 hops to get down there. That's what this depth value is that you see here. So virtual machines are 2 hops down this hierarchy from cluster. Hosts are 1 hop down. If you're at the cluster and you want to look at performance metrics for the cluster, depth is equal to 0. Now, you can potentially, in your formula, specify a negative depth value. For example, if we're applying our supermetric at the level of cluster and we say depth equals -1, well, -1 says go up 1 level in the hierarchy of objects. The thing that's 1 level up from clusters is your data centers. Admittedly, using negative depth numbers is fairly unusual, but it is an option that's available to you. Before you start creating a supermetric, you should take a little time to think about the design of the supermetric. So if you're going to create a supermetric, you need to know what objects are going to be involved for whatever it is you're tracking. Again, those may be all the same type of object, or it could be a combination of types of objects. You need to think about which performance metrics, again, those are the existing performance metrics, which performance metrics you plan to combine together in your supermetric. You need to think about how you're going to combine those performance metrics together. In other words, what is your formula? Additionally, you need to think about where you're going to assign the supermetric. Again, the place where the performance metrics reside may not be the same place where you plan to apply or assign the supermetric. So understanding those 2 levels is what's going to help you to calculate that depth value we mentioned a few moments ago. And additionally, you're going to need to make certain that you enable your supermetric to be calculated. The way you do that is by setting that up in the policy editor. Until you've gone into the policy editor and said, I want to enable the supermetric, until you do that, vRealize Operations isn't going to do anything. So it's essential that you go into the policy editor and enable your supermetric. Previously, I mentioned that at times you're going to be working with a single object. Other times you'll be working with a multitude of objects. If you're working with a single object, what you will find you'll be doing in your formula is using simpler mathematical operations to indicate what you want to happen. For instance, maybe you want to add these 2 supermetrics together, or maybe you want to subtract one from the other, or we want to multiply or divide. Again, it's your supermetric, it's your formula, you get to decide. So when working with a singular object, we're going to use simple mathematical operations like those. On the other hand, when you're working with a multitude of objects, when you're working with an object type and you receive back an attribute type, in that case, you're going to use what's known as a looping function. We're going to see what those looping functions are in the following slides. Here are some examples of looping functions. We have the average looping function. The average looping function takes an attribute type, all the values that we got back, and returns the average value. Count tells you how many values we received. Minimum and maximum obviously return the minimum of the values or the maximum of the values, and sum allows you to tally them all up, add them up. Here are some additional looping functions. So if you need to know the absolute value of a value that you received, you can use the absolute value function. We also have various trig functions such as arc cosine, arc sine, arc tangent. To see a full list of all of the looping functions that are available to you, pay attention in a few slides when I show you how to use the supermetric editor, because you can see all of the mathematical operations and all of these looping functions are listed in that tool. As I said earlier, sometimes you're just working with a singular object and your formula is going to consist of simple mathematical operations such as plus, minus, multiply, and divide. In addition to those basic mathematical operators, we also have comparison operators such as equal to, not equal to, less than, greater than. In all the examples that we've been giving so far, we have been assuming that the performance metric or metrics that we're working with return numbers. The majority of performance metrics return numbers. But there are some supermetrics that, instead of returning a number, return a string. So in your supermetric, we have these string operators that you can use. For instance, you can test to see whether the value of a performance metric is equal to some string. Or you can say, I want to know if the supermetric contains a particular string. So you can pause the video here if you'd like to read through all these, but in general, these are all string operators. When you create a supermetric, we're going to take you through 4 steps. There's the basic info step, the step where you create your formula, the step where you assign your supermetric to a particular type of object, and a place where you will enable your supermetric in one or more policies. When you're in the create a formula step, there are 3 main sections on the screen. There's a section up top that has drop-down list that allows you to see a list of all the looping functions and all the mathematical operators. And right below that, there's the area where you're going to enter your formula. Now, notice I said enter here. I didn't say type. You will type, but you don't have to type everything. There's a couple of ways we're going to help you shortcut all the typing required for the formula. One of the ways that we shorten the amount of typing you have to do is you don't have to type the name of the functions or type the operators. You can just choose them from the drop-down list, and whatever function or whatever operator you selected will get automatically inserted into your formula, wherever your insert cursor may be. Another way that we will shorten the amount of typing that you have to do is that when you specify the type of object and the metric that we want to work on, you don't have to type out the full name of the object. For instance, instead of typing virtual space machine, you can type VIR and a window will pop up from which you can choose virtual machine. Same thing for the metrics. You type a portion of the name of the metric, will pop up a window of metrics that match what you've typed, select the one you want, and you're good to go. In the formulas that you write, you'll recall we discussed earlier the notion of the depth value. So in your formulas, you can specify your depth value. Now, strictly speaking, entering the depth value is not required. There is a default depth value. The default depth value is 1. For me personally, I find it, in my experience, worth the effort to type the depth value every single time. The reason why I say that, the reason why I type the depth value into my formula every time, even though I wouldn't have to if I wanted depth 1, the reason why I always type it is I like to have my formulas be explicit and clear. I want to make certain that if any of my colleagues look at my formula, there will be no doubt what the depth value is. That will help me avoid situations where sometimes colleagues will think that if I haven't specified the depth value, that the depth value must therefore default to 0. A lot of folks think that the depth value defaults to 0, but you know that's not correct. Now, I don't want to have to go to train all my colleagues the difference between the correct depth value, default depth value, versus the one that they think. So rather than tackle that, I just always specify the depth value explicitly. But it's up to you to decide whether you want to do that. So again, back to the editor. Up top, we've got our functions and operators. Here, we've got our formula. And then down below, you have a preview area where you can see what your supermetric looks like for data that we've already collected. So the supermetric that you see plotted in this graph here is not a live preview, but rather it's using old data, historically collected data, to see and show you what the effect of the supermetric formula looks like. Again, a supermetric, once we're all done here, will work with live data. But here in the preview, we're just looking at data that had already been collected. The supermetrics administration page allows you to create supermetrics, edit them, delete them, duplicate them. So the majority of the work that you're going to do with supermetric is going to be on that administration page. When you create a supermetric, as we saw in the previous slide, there are 4 steps. There's the first step in which you're going to provide some basic info. Essentially, you're going to provide you're going to provide the name of your supermetric and a description. In step 2, you're going to specify what your formula is. Step 3, you're going to associate your supermetric with a type of object. And then step 4, you're going to enable your supermetric in 1 or more policies. In the following slides, we'll see all 4 of these steps in action. In step number 1 of the new supermetric wizard, you need to specify the name of your supermetric, a description, and optionally, you can specify a unit label. For example, percent or seconds, milliseconds, megabytes, kilobytes, gigahertz. Again, those are examples of units. So you can select the unit from the drop-down list. So as you can see, the step 1 basic info is very straightforward. Step 2 is where things get more complex, and they get as complex as you want to make them. The more complex your supermetric, the more complex your formula is going to be. But let's take a look at a simpler supermetric and what it would take to enter its formula. So as you can see, if we look at this screenshot on the top, if we're in the create a formula step, our job is to type a formula that the supermetric will use to calculate its values. In this particular case, we have typed AVG, or we could have selected the average looping function from the functions drop-down list. Whenever you use a looping function, it's going to require some arguments, which we're going to put into these parentheses. Now, in this example, I would like to get an average of some performance metric from virtual machines. So I could type virtual machine in its entirety, but as I type a portion of the name of the type of object that has the performance metric, it's going to pop up this window or this menu from which we can select the type of object that we want the supermetric to work with. So in this case here, we're choosing virtual machine. Again, I don't have to fully type out virtual machine. I can type a portion of it and pick what I want from the list. So even though I only typed a portion of the name, as you can see over here, it has expanded that partial name to the full name of the object that we're working with. After typing the name of the object, we'll type a colon, and then we'll type a portion of the name of the performance metric that we want to use. Again, just like with the object, I don't have to type the full name of the performance metric. I just type a portion of it. It pops up a little window. I select the one I want, and it will spell out that performance metric in the formula. So again, I did not have to specify virtual letter by spelling it all the way out. I did not have to type fully out CPU usage percentage. I just type a portion of each of those and pick from the pop-up what I want to work with. And then as you can see in our example here, once again, we have our depth value. Again, as I explained previously, the default depth value is 1, but you'll encounter a lot of colleagues who think it's 0. So again, my recommendation, or at least what I do for myself, is I always explicitly specify the depth value. Even if that means typing depth equals 1 explicitly, I personally find it to be useful to be that explicit. While you're in the wizard creating your new supermetric, as you're typing in the formula, you can actually see the effect of your formula by going to the preview section. In the preview section, you can feed in some object. The data from that object will be fed into the formula, and the supermetric value will be calculated and plotted on the screen. Again, as a quick reminder, when you're in the preview section, what you're looking at is the supermetric using historical data. To see the supermetric with actual live data, you're going to have to go through a couple more steps in the wizard. In step 3 of the wizard, you need to pick the object type that the supermetric is assigned to. For example, earlier we talked about a supermetric that was going to look at performance metrics for virtual machines, but we were assigning the supermetric at a higher level. We were assigning the supermetric at the cluster level, which you can see us doing here in this example. So this is where we're specifying the object on which the supermetric is applied. The metrics may be coming from someplace else. Again, that's what the depth value is going to help us define, but this is the object where the supermetric is applied. The final step in this wizard is to enable the supermetric in a policy, which you can do here in the supermetric wizard. Alternatively, you can always go to the policy editor, go to the metrics and properties section of the policy editor, and you can enable and disable these supermetrics straight in the policy editor. Once you've gone through all 4 steps of the supermetric wizard, you can then go to see the supermetric in action. To do so, you could go, there are a variety of places where you can see your supermetrics, but here we're illustrating seeing the supermetric by going into the object browser, selecting an object. In this case, this is the object. This is an object that's of the type that we said the supermetric's applied to. If you click this button here, you'll see a list of all your metrics, and once you've defined your first supermetric, you'll have this new container here labeled supermetrics. Within there, you will see the new supermetric that you have defined, and if you double click it, just like a metric, a performance metric, if you double click a supermetric, we'll plot its value over here on the right. Now, in this specific case, we don't see much in terms of time. We don't see much about this performance metric because we just created it. Again, this is our first instance of the supermetric being calculated. So if we let enough time go by, we'll actually start to see this supermetric plotting more and more time related data points. One important point here, and this is particularly important for the lab that you're about to do. When you create a supermetric, you have to wait up to 5 minutes before you're going to be able to see the supermetric being calculated live. As I suspect you've already guessed, the reason why you have to wait up to 5 minutes is the supermetric is not going to be calculated until the next 5-minute data collection interval. Recall that vRealize Operations does data collection once every 5 minutes. We've got to wait for the next data collection before you're going to be able to see your supermetric. So when you get to this point in the lab that's coming up and you're waiting up to 5 minutes, that might be a good time to take a coffee break or a walk around the block or something. Once the supermetric is up and running, you'll get to see it calculated again and again. But the first time you look at a supermetric, you might have to wait up to 5 minutes. In this part of our lesson, we're going to discuss one way you can enhance your supermetrics, and that involves using something called a where clause. But just before we do, I'd like to show you in our demo environment where you can go to find information about additional techniques that you can use to enhance your supermetrics. As you can see, I've started my web browser and I've gone to docs.vmware.com. That's the place to go to see all the official product documentation for our products. Now, I'm here because I want to look at the vRealize Operations documentation that explains multiple ways you can enhance your supermetric formulas. So first I have to find the product, vRealize Operations, which I'll find by clicking on All Products. vRealize Operations starts with the letter V, so I'll click the letter V. And after scrolling through all the products that begin with the letter V, down towards the bottom we can see vRealize Operations. As you know from the beginning of this course, there's actually both a cloud version of vRealize Operations and an on-prem version of vRealize Operations. Here in this course, we're using the on-prem version, so I'm going to look at the on-prem documentation. As you can see, there are different sets of the documentation. The part I'm interested in is under configuring, and within there I'm going to go to configuring supermetrics. But before I go any further, do notice that we have documentation for different versions of vRealize operations. So it's always a good idea to make certain that you're looking at the right version of the documentation. We're using vRealize operations 8.6 in the training lab environment, so we'll look at the 8.6 documentation. So again, I've gone to vRealize operations, configuring, and now I'm going to take a look at what documents they have for us here in configuring supermetrics. So there's a section that talks about how to create a supermetric, how to export them and import them, and so forth. But notice there's a section here titled Enhancing Your Supermetrics. That's what I wanted to show you. If you click on Enhancing Your Supermetrics, it describes the where clause, which I'm just about to describe to you. That's one way of enhancing your supermetrics. You can also enhance your supermetrics by using resource entry aliasing and conditional expressions. So we'll leave it to you, the student, as an exercise to read through this documentation, but let's go see some actual examples of using where clauses. The basic idea behind a where clause is to allow us to filter the results that we're getting. Instead of looking at all the data, we're going to zero in and focus in on just some of the data. In your formula, you can say things such as where, equal, and then a performance metric. So let's take a look at an actual example. We'll jump straight down to the bottom part of this slide. This is a supermetric formula. It's using the count looping function. The count looping function simply gives us a count of how many values we get back from looking up the performance metric. In this specific case, the performance metric that we're looking at is the sys powered on supermetric. That performance metric allows us to detect whether or not a host is powered on. That metric is a metric of host systems. And host systems and all the other vSphere objects are monitored by the vCenter data adapter. The nickname for that is VMware. So this first part of our function is a bit more specific and spelled out more explicitly than we saw in the supermetric editor. What you see in the supermetric editor is sort of a shorthand of the actual formula. So here is the actual formula. If we were to get a count of that supermetric, then what we would get back is a count of how many values we received. If we use the supermetric and left off the where clause, then this supermetric would tell us how many hosts there are in our environment, which is not what we want. What we'd like the supermetric to do is to let us know how many hosts are powered on. If we leave off the where clause here, the reason why we're going to get a count of the number of hosts is because every host has this performance metric. I don't want a count of how many hosts have this supermetric. That'll just tell me how many hosts we have. What I want to know in this example is how many hosts are powered on. So if we add to our formulas where equals 1, what we're saying in this short expression is that I only want to count hosts who have the value 1 for this performance metric. If sys pipeline powered on is 1, that means the host is powered on. If it's 0, it means it's powered on. So by using this where clause, we're saying if the host is powered on, then we're going to count it. Otherwise, we're not going to count it. So again, by adding the where clause, if we don't have that where clause, you get a count of the number of hosts, but by adding the where clause, you get something arguably more interesting. You get a count of how many hosts are powered on. So this is one example of a supermetric. In the next slide, we'll take a look at another. In this slide, you can see another supermetric formula. along with down in the diagram, the screenshot on the bottom, you can see the steps that you would go through to use the supermetric. But I'm more interested right now in enhancing the formula. So what I would encourage you to do right now is to hit the pause button and read through this formula and see if you can decipher what it's saying. So go ahead and hit pause, and when you're done, let's talk about exactly what the supermetric is saying. Now that you're done thinking about this formula, let's decipher what it's saying. So it's saying here that we're going to get a count of something. Specifically, what we're going to get a count of is, okay, it's some sort of object that's being monitored by the vCenter data adapter. Oh, here's the type of object. We're going to get a count of something to do with virtual machines. Specifically, what we're going to get a count of is their CPU usage averages. But again, every single virtual machine has that performance metric. If we fail to do a where clause, then all we're going to get is a count of all the virtual machines that have that metric, which they all do. That's not what we want the supermetric to do. According to the use case text up here, we want to know which or how many virtual machines have CPU usage greater than 60%. So we slightly modify our formula by adding in a where clause. Now, in this where clause, we're being a bit more explicit than the previous example. In this case, we're actually using the special variable $value. $value is referring to the value of this performance metric, and we're simply testing to see if as we get each performance metric value, we're testing to see whether that virtual machine's value for this performance metric is greater than 60%. If so, then we're going to count that virtual machine. If not, then we don't count the virtual machine. Now, if you pause the video and looked at the formula like I challenged you to do, there's one more part of this formula that you're probably asking yourself about, which is this high depth value. In our earlier examples, our depth values were much smaller numbers, like 1 or 2. But if you wanted to get a count of the virtual machines across your entire infrastructure that had CPU usage above 60%, adding this higher depth number would allow you to evaluate this supermetric formula on all the virtual machines in your entire infrastructure. In this lab, you're going to be creating supermetrics. Notice, if you will, that tasks 4 and 5 are optional. So if you just want to get a feel for how to create supermetrics, do tasks 1 through 3. But 4 and 5 will show you how to use those where clauses we discussed. Once you're done with the lab, join me in the next video and we'll do a quick recap on this lesson. Now that you're done with the lab, let's do a quick recap of the lesson. So in this lesson, we talked about how to create supermetrics. We talked about how to associate them with objects. We learned how to enable supermetrics in your policies. And additionally, we talked about how to create the formulas your supermetrics uses. Plus, we talked about ways of enhancing your supermetrics using techniques such as where clauses. Once again, we've reached the end of a module. If you'd like to, you can hit pause to review these key points. When you're done, join me in the next video and we'll start the next module. In this module, we're going to discuss how to secure your vRealize operations deployment using user access control. Controlling which users can log in and what they can do within vRealize operations is crucial in order to be able to control the security of your environment. So in this particular module, we're going to be diving down into various security-related topics. In this lesson, we'll be discussing user access control. We're going to talk about how vRealize operations authenticates different types of users. We'll talk about how vRealize operations authorizes users in order to control what they can do. We're going to talk about how we handle situations where users have multiple roles and therefore multiple privileges. We'll talk about how to create local users and groups. And additionally, we're going to talk about how to import LDAP users, such as users from Active Directory. When setting up security in vRealize operations, we will in effect be creating rules to describe who can do what and what objects they can have access to. So to put that in just sort of informal terms, we're going to be creating rules that in effect say things like a particular user, let's call him user Alfred, he's going to be allowed to generate reports, and he's going to be able to do that for objects in the production cluster. Again, in this rule, there's 3 parts to it. There's the part that specifies who we're empowering. There's a part that specifies what privilege or permissions we're giving them. And then there's a part of the rule that specifies what objects they're going to be able to exercise those privileges on. Now, to put this into a bit more technical terminology, we distinguish between the concept of authentication versus authorization. And it's important to understand the distinction before we move onwards. Authentication is the process by which we determine whether or not a user is allowed in to vRealize operations. And additionally, if they are allowed in, we determine what their identity is. Who is this person? On the other hand, authorization is the process that we go through in order to determine what that user is able to do and what objects they can exercise their newfound powers upon. So again, in your mind, separate the process of authentication from the process of authorization. vRealize operations uses a role-based access control mechanism in which the administrator assigns roles to different users. So for instance, the administrator might say that user A is granted the read-only role. Now what each of these roles is a collection of privileges or permissions. This module actually uses those 2 terms interchangeably. So the role, in this example, the read-only role, is a collection of permissions that we specify. Now there are several predefined roles, including read-only, content admin, and power user. We'll look at all the predefined roles a little later in this lesson, but those predefined roles can be used and or you can create your own roles. But in each case, the roles are collections of permissions that we're going to grant to users. vRealize operations can authenticate a variety of different types of users. So far in the labs, you've been logging in as an account called admin. That admin account is an example of a local user. You can create additional local users if you choose to. Alternatively, you can use other types of users that already exist in systems such as LDAP, Active Directory, Open LDAP, vCenter Server, Single Sign-On, vSphere Single Sign-On, and VMware's VMware Identity Manager. Now, one of the things that we want you to recognize here is that later on in this lesson, we're going to create new local users. But for all these other types of users, they already exist. We don't need to create them because they already exist. For example, Active Directory users already exist in Active Directory, so we don't have to create them. What we do have to do, and we'll learn how to do this later on in this lesson, what we do have to do is import users from sources such as Active Directory into vRealize operations. Now, another thing that this particular slide is drawing our attention to is the fact that certain types of users, such as LDAP users, local users, and VMware Identity Manager users, all potentially have access to all of the objects that vRealize operations is monitoring. Now, of course, we can tailor that. We can say they only have access to a certain collection of objects, but these 3 types of users have the potential to see all the objects that vRealize operations is monitoring. On the other hand, vCenter users and single sign-on users are only going to be able to see vSphere objects when they're logged into vRealize operations. In other words, if you log into vRealize operations using your vCenter credentials, you're only going to see in vRealize operations the same objects you would have seen if you logged into the vSphere client. Again, we have these 5 major types of ways that we can authenticate users logging into vRealize operations. And one last comment about this authentication concept. You have logged in during the labs. You've logged in multiple times into vRealize operations. And perhaps you've done it so quickly that you may or may not have noticed that in addition to specifying your username and password, on that login screen, just above the username and password fields, there's a drop-down list in which you can choose which type of user you're logging in as. That drop-down list has been defaulting to the local user, which is why you've been able to just simply type admin and the administrator's password. But in order to log in as other users, you're going to have to, other types of users, you're going to have to use that drop-down list to select which type of user. And if the type of user you're trying to log into is not in that list, it's because you need to set up a connection between vRealize operations and that external authentication system. We're going to see how to do that later on in this lesson. When you log in to vRealize operations as a local user, the username and password, your credentials, get passed into vRealize operations into the authentication module. The authentication module sees that you're logging in as a local user, and as a result, the authentication module looks up your user account in the database built into vRealize operations. On the other hand, for all of these other types of accounts, such as a vCenter server user, when a vCenter server user logs into vRealize operations, the authentication module sees that that's not a local account. It's a vCenter server account that's logging in. And as a result, the authentication module does not look up the user in the database in vRealize operations because that user is not in that database. Rather, vRealize operations delegates the authentication to vCenter in this particular case. Obviously, if you are logging in as an OpenLDAP user, delegate to OpenLDAP. If you're logging in as a VIDM user, it'll delegate to there. In other words, if you log in as a local user into vRealize operations, that's the one case where the authentication is actually being performed by vRealize operations. In all the other cases, vRealize operations is simply delegating the authentication to the external authentication system. Later on in this lesson, when we discuss assigning roles to users, we're also going to discuss the fact that when specifying those roles, you're also going to have to specify what objects you want the user to have access to. And as you're going to discover, and as we are hinting at here in this particular slide, you will have the ability, if you want to grant users access to an individual object if you want. But your vRealize operations environment is monitoring so many different objects that assigning access to individual objects is probably going to be cumbersome. What you need, you can do that where necessary, but what you need in general is the ability to specify a bunch of objects that you want the user to have access to. And as you can see illustrated here, we have a variety of ways you can do that. If you've created a custom object group with the objects in it, you can say, I want to give the user access to this entire custom object group and all the objects contained in that custom object group. Again, instead of assigning access to one object or a few objects individually, we can give access to all the objects contained in the custom object group that you configured. Another way that we can specify what objects a user has access to is to use what are known as inventory trees. Each data adapter can define its own inventory tree or trees. For example, the vCenter data adapter has 3 different trees called hosts and clusters, also network gain, and storage. If you're a vSphere administrator, this probably sounds a whole lot like the 4 views that you know from the vSphere client. The vSphere client has 4 views called host and clusters, VMs and templates, networking, and storage. Here in vRealize operations, the VM portion is actually folded into host and clusters. So the inventory tree is called host and clusters, but it's really host, clusters, and virtual machines. So you can, by picking one of those inventory trees, such as the host and clusters inventory tree, you can give a user access to all the objects that are hosts and clusters and virtual machines. Alternatively, you can use these inventory trees to zero in on specific objects of those types. So for instance, if I go into the host and clusters tree, I can pick an entire cluster or a host along with all the virtual machines that are on it. So again, inventory trees ultimately give you multiple ways to grant access to a multitude of objects. As we've said perhaps a couple times already in this lesson, roles are collections of privileges, although sometimes we'll use the word permissions instead. Again, this lesson sort of flip-flops between the two. But whether you call them privileges or permissions, those specify the individual tasks that we want users to be able to perform. So again, when we grant a role to a user or a group of users, what we're saying is we want those users to be able to perform whatever tasks the privileges in that role specifies. A few slides ago, we talked about how things behave differently for authentication depending upon whether you're logging in as a local user or some other type of user. Now we're going to have a similar discussion about how authorization takes place depending upon what type of user you're logging in as. So again, now we're talking about authorization. When a user logs into vRealize operations and gets through that authentication stage, when we subsequently need to figure out what the user is authorized to do, what's going to happen is if the user is a local user, an LDAP user, again, that could be Active Directory or Open LDAP, or if the user is a VMware Identity Manager user, in all three of these cases, it is vRealize operations itself that determines what these users are going to be able to do. That's different from other types of accounts, such as vCenter server accounts. So let's take a look at what happens with vCenter accounts. If you log into vRealize operations using your vCenter credentials, then vRealize operations does not perform the authorization to specify what you can do. Rather, if you are logging into vRealize operations as a vCenter user, then it is your vCenter permissions that govern what you're going to be able to do in vRealize operations. The reason why we set it up this way is so that if we empower somebody, for example, a vSphere administrator, to log into vRealize operations, we want to make certain that vRealize operations is granting them the same level of access, but no more access than they would have had they been logging into the vCenter server using the vSphere client. As we've seen in the previous slides, vRealize operations can authenticate various types of users. One type of user that every VROps customer is going to use is the local user, because at a minimum, you need to have that admin account. If a customer has no other form of authentication, such as Active Directory or VMware Identity Manager, then a customer can create just local accounts. But typically, customers have some sort of directory service, such as Active Directory. And in that directory service, they already have accounts created. So rather than recreate the accounts as local users, vRealize operations customers will typically integrate vRealize operations with whatever directory service that they happen to be using. So Active Directory users and Open LDAP users tend to be used for lots of user accounts in vRealize operations. So whether you're an IT manager, an executive, or a technical person, your account being in some sort of LDAP server would make sense. For users who happen to be vSphere administrators, bringing them into vRealize operations using vCenter authentication and authorization provides a easy, seamless way to give them access to vRealize operations. VMware Identity Manager tends to be used in situations where customers have more specialized authentication mechanisms, such as two-factor authentication, smart cards, and so forth. But again, vRealize Operations strives to provide a variety of authentication mechanisms. Which ones you use depends upon your business case. This is the access control page where you can manage users, groups, roles, and the privileges they contain. Plus, you can also set password policies and set a login message. What we're going to be doing in the slides that come up is to take a look in each of these different tabs to see what you can do. vRealize Operations is automatically configured to support local users. So you can manage local users right away. But for other types of users, such as Active Directory users, Open LDAP users, vCenter users, for other types of accounts, such as those, you need to create a connection between vRealize Operations and that external system. And we do that by configuring what we call an authentication source. As you can see here in the screenshot, to do so, you would go to the Authentication Sources section, click the Add button, and then you'll give each of your different authentication sources a distinct name so that you can tell them apart. And then you'll tell us what type of authentication system it is. Is it Active Directory? Is it VMware Identity Manager? You tell us what it is. And then in the section that follows, you'll answer questions that are specific to that type of authentication system. We'll take a look at an Active Directory example here in a moment. vRealize Operations uses a role-based access control mechanism. And out of the box, there are 4 roles that are defined: administrator, power user, content admin, and read-only. If you grant an account the administrator role, for example, the account called admin has the administrator role, any account with that administrator role can do anything in vRealize Operations. They have full access, full privilege to the entire system, including they can modify how role-based access control is set up. Power users are powerful users, but they're not quite as powerful as administrators. They can do everything that the administrator can do with 2 exceptions. They're not able to modify the role-based access control settings, and they're not allowed to manage the vRealize Operations cluster. A content administrator is less powerful than both of those 2 previous roles. The content administrator is able to administer content, by which we mean dashboards, alerts, symptoms, recommendations, views, and so forth. So if you're a content administrator, you can manipulate those types of content. On the other hand, a read-only user, out of all 4 of these roles, a read-only user has the least privilege, but they can see things in vRealize Operations. They can see dashboards. They can't modify the dashboards. They can't create dashboards, but they can see them. They can see reports. They can't create the report templates, but they can see the report templates and reports. So the majority of your users are likely to be read-only users, just to give them the core functionality of vRealize Operations. But for your more advanced users, your more technical users that you trust to administer your environment, we have the first 3 roles: administrator, power user, and content administrator. In the next series of slides, we're going to be talking about how to manage local accounts in vRealize Operations, starting with how to create local accounts. When you create a local account, you'll give that account a name. Optionally, as you can see here in steps 2 and 3, you can create a group to put that user in, and or you can simply put the local user into an existing local group. Step 4 is you need to assign the role or roles you want the user to have. And then step 5 is associating that user with what objects you want them to be able to work with. Here's what the user interface looks like when you add a local user. When you add a local user, the wizard interface we take you into has 2 different steps, step 1 and step 2. In step 1, you're going to provide basic information about the user. For instance, you need to supply the name of the user. So what's their account name? You need to specify what their password is. we ask you for that user's first name and last name and email address. Optionally, you can supply a description for each of the accounts. And then the two checkboxes down towards the bottom allow you to say, either while creating the account or after you've created the account, you can disable or enable the account. And the final checkbox allows you to require the user to change their password the next time that they log in. Again, this is the first of two steps. Let's take a look at the second step. In the second step, we're going to assign the permissions, or more accurately, the roles that we want the user to have, and we're going to specify what groups the user can is a member of. So notice in step number 2 that there are two tabs, Groups tab and an Objects tab. In the Groups tab, this is where you can specify which groups defined in vRealize operations you want the user to be a member of. Now, in this particular screenshot, we only have a single group. You may have multiple groups defined in vRealize operations, in which case you would see them all listed here. But on the Groups tab, you're simply going to select the group or groups that you want this local user to belong to. But we're not done with step number 2. Step number 2 also has this Objects tab. In the Objects tab, you're going to do two things. One of the things that you're going to do here is specify what role or roles you want assigned to the user. And then additionally, on the Objects tab, you're going to specify what objects you want the user to have access to. So up top, for the role, you're going to specify a role such as administrator, or power user, or content administrator, or read-only user. Additionally, later on in this module, we'll show you how to create your own custom roles. So here, you select the role that you want assigned to the user. Don't forget to check the checkbox to actually explicitly state, I want this user to be assigned this role. After you've assigned the role, down on the bottom, you have a variety of ways that you can specify what objects you want the user to have access to. You can say, I want this user to have access to every single object that vRealize operations is monitoring. Chances are you don't want to do that with most users, but you can, where appropriate, you can give a user access to every single object. Down below, you have some other choices such as adapter instance. For example, if I chose adapter instance, I could go to the vCenter server data adapter and pick a specific vCenter server. This machine here called VRops Cloud is actually a vCenter server. If I check this checkbox, then the user will have access, within vRealize operations, will have access to all the objects being managed by that vCenter server. Now, both of these techniques, whether you select the allow access to everything, or even allow me access to everything on a vCenter server, both of those are pretty darn permissive. We may not want to grant access to so many objects. So there's a third technique, which I'll show you in a moment, that allows you much more granular control over exactly which objects you want the user to have access to. In this screenshot, we're still in step 2, and we're still on the Objects tab. A moment ago, I told you that there is a way to assign which objects you want to have the user have access to, but to do so in a more granular fashion. And that involves these things known as inventory trees. Each data adapter can define its own inventory trees. For instance, the vCenter data adapter defines an inventory tree called vSphere Host and Clusters, another inventory tree called vSphere Networking, and another called vSphere Storage. Incidentally, vSphere Host and Clusters includes not just hosts and clusters, it also includes virtual machines. So those three views are very closely mapped to the views that you've seen in the vSphere world. In the vSphere world, you presumably know that in the vSphere world, if you use the vSphere client, you can go into 4 different views. The host and clusters view, the VMs and templates view, the networking view, and the storage view. And similarly, here in vRealize operations, we can do the same thing. The difference being that vRealize operations collapses both host and clusters and VMs together into a single inventory tree. But if I want to, I can select vSphere Host and Clusters, and then over on the right side of the wizard, I can check the checkboxes for the exact objects that I want this user to have access to when they're logged into vRealize operations. Again, doing it this way, working with these inventory trees, is going to give you more precise, more granular control over exactly which objects the user does or doesn't have access to. In the preceding slides, we've been talking about local users. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about local groups. Or to be more explicit, these are groups of users defined locally in vRealize operations. The procedure for creating a new local group is very similar to creating a new local user. So you're going to see a lot of similarity here. If you understood how to create a local user, creating a local group is simple. So when you create a local group, you are going to assign it a name, just like you did with a local user. You have to assign the group a name. You will assign the users that you want to be a member of this group, and then you will assign what role or roles you want the group to have, and additionally, what objects you want users in this group to have access to. Again, if that sounds similar to what we did when adding a local user, you're right. It is very similar. Not only is the process of creating a local group similar to creating a local user, the wizard interface that you use to create a local group is very similar to what we saw when we created a local user. So just like when we create a local user, when we add a new local group, we have two steps. In the first step, we're going to provide a name and a description for our new group. So here is our new local group called vrops-admin. Here's our description. And then in step 2, we're going to do essentially the same thing we did when adding a local user. So let's take a look at step 2. In step 2, once again, we have two tabs. The second tab is the same as we saw before for local users. The first tab's a little different. When we are adding a local user, this tab was labeled groups, and it allowed us to put the new user into a group. Here, it's just the opposite. Here we have a tab labeled members, which allows us to say which users, so by checking these checkboxes, you're specifying which local users you want to put into this new local group. Again, it's just the reverse. It's the same idea, but just the reverse of what we saw with a local user. Then after filling out checking the checkboxes on the Members tab, we'll go to the Objects tab. The Objects tab works here for new local groups the same way it did for new local users. So once again, we're going to specify what role we want to assign to the group, and then using one of those 3 techniques I mentioned before, you're going to specify what objects you want users of this group to have access to. Again, we could say I want to give them access to everything, or we could say I want to give them access to all of the objects managed by this vCenter server, or by using inventory trees, we have the most granular control over exactly what users who are part of this new group are going to have access to. In this slide, we're still in the Objects tab. We just simply have here a screenshot finally showing us the checkbox selected to give access to all the objects. Again, at any point you want, you can check this checkbox to give a group of users or local user access to all the objects being monitored by vRealize operations. But for obvious security reasons, you presumably want to use this checkbox infrequently. Only the users that you trust most of all would you check this checkbox. In vRealize operations, it's possible for a user to have multiple roles assigned to them. So a single user might have multiple roles because the user might be part of multiple groups. Each group can have a different role, therefore the user can have multiple roles. The reason why we're talking about this is vRealize operations has its way of handling that sort of situation. In other computer systems, they operate on what might be called the least access principle. In those types of systems, if you had multiple roles assigned to you or multiple privileges assigned to you, in a least access system, you would get whatever the least amount of privilege those roles have granted you. But that's not how vRealize Operations behaves. In vRealize Operations, if you're a user in vRealize Operations and you have been assigned multiple roles, you are going to get the combined power of all those roles. So as an example, if you're a user and you've been given access to a virtual machine, let's say VM1, and by virtue of one group, you've been assigned the read-only role, and by virtue of being a member of another group, you've been assigned the administrator role, you will, in effect, have the power of administrator because you're getting all of the privileges granted by the read-only role, which is a small subset of privileges, but you're also getting all of the privileges that an administrator gets, which is everything. Administrators have everything. So unlike a least access system where you would effectively only get the read-only role, in the case of vRealize Operations, it doesn't work that way. Instead, you get the combined power. In effect, you would be as powerful as any other administrator. For local users, you can define how passwords behave in vRealize Operations. Now, what we're about to describe here is not for Active Directory users or vCenter users or those other types. This is just for local users. All those other types of users have password control mechanisms built into them. So for example, if you had wanted to change the way Active Directory users' passwords work in vRealize Operations, you would actually go to Active Directory. So we're just talking about local users here. If you want to set up a password policy for your local users, you would go to Access Control. And here's the tab where we went to create local users. Here's the tab where we went to create local groups. Later on, we'll talk about assigning roles, but this fourth tab here, Password Policy, is where you can go to set up the password policy for local users. When you go to the Password Policy tab, it'll first show you what your policy is. If you want to change the policy, you can click Edit, and it will bring up this interface here. Now, I'd encourage you to hit the pause key and take a look at each of these settings, but they're all pretty straightforward. If you've ever dealt with password policies in other computer systems, we are providing you, in effect, the same sorts of settings. So you can specify things like, should vRealize Operations lock that local user account if somebody's trying to break in? If we do lock them out, how many failed attempts before we lock them out? You can specify the minimum length of a password. And again, if you hit pause, you can read through the rest of these and see that we give you the usual sorts of password controls. But again, remember, this is for password policies on local users. I'm going to make a suggestion right now. I suggest you go take a break. Maybe go get yourself a beverage, maybe go take a walk around the block, or maybe at a minimum, just shake your brain cells loose. Because in the preceding slides, we've been discussing how to work with local users. What we're about to do in these slides coming up is to talk about the other types of users. For example, Active Directory users. Again, I suggest you take some sort of break so that the discussion that we just had about local users doesn't blend in with and overlap with the current discussion about Active Directory users. So again, take a break, do something, rest up, and when you're done, come back here and we will talk about importing LDAP users. So now that you're back from that restorative break, we are about to talk about LDAP users. We're going to use Active Directory users specifically as our example, but the techniques that we're talking about here work for Active Directory users, Open LDAP users, and other types of non-local users. When we talked about local users, we spoke of creating or adding a new local user to vRealize Operations. Now that we're talking about Active Directory users and Open LDAP users and users like those, we're not going to be creating or adding those accounts because they already exist. Your Active Directory users already exist in Active Directory. We don't need to create them. So instead of creating Active Directory users, if I needed to do that, I would go to Active Directory. But here in vRealize Operations, instead of creating Active Directory users, what we're going to do is import them into vRealize Operations. So let's take a look at what that involves. So if you've got some LDAP users that you want to allow into vRealize Operations, we're going to import them by following this procedure. Step one is you need to create what's known as an LDAP import source. I'll show you exactly what that entails in a moment. Once you have that LDAP import source, and not before, once you have that LDAP import source, you can import the users from that LDAP source, which in our examples is going to be Active Directory. Next, you can optionally assign those LDAP users, those Active Directory users, to local vRealize Operations groups, and you can assign a role to the user that you just imported from Active Directory. And furthermore, you can specify what objects you want that user to have access to. Now, to draw this out a little more generally, steps 2 through 5 here are very similar to what you did when working with local users. Again, perhaps the one difference being here we're going to import the LDAP user, whereas before we added or created a local user. But ignoring that distinction, steps 2 through 5 are essentially the same thing that we did for local users. The difference for a non-local user, such as an Active Directory user, is that first step, creating your LDAP import source. So let's see what it takes to create your LDAP import source. To create an LDAP import source, you're going to log into the vRealize Operations Product UI. You'll go to Administration, then you'll go to Authentication Sources. You'll say, I want to add a new source. And then the very first thing you'll do is give a name for this new source. You may have multiple authentication sources, so give each one a different name so you can distinguish them. And then crucially, you're going to tell us what type of directory service you're connecting to. In this example here, you can see us connecting to Open LDAP, but we could connect to Active Directory or VIDM or other such sources. Depending upon what choice you make here, that will change what questions you are asked from here on out. So if we're connecting to, let's say instead of Open LDAP, let's say that we're connecting to Active Directory. The next question that you're asked is, do you want to do this in a basic mode or in advanced mode? If you choose basic mode, we'll ask you a few questions and we'll assume a lot of default values. On the other hand, if you choose advanced, you will be asked a lot of specific questions and thereby have a lot of control over how vRealize Operations does the integration. So let's take a look at advanced. Now, even advanced is not that tricky, provided you know the answers. Now, I can guess a lot of these answers. I'll show you some of the guesses I would make, but you really ought to talk to your directory service administrator, whether that's the Active Directory admin or the Open LDAP admin. You should talk to them because the answers that we're giving here are going to depend upon how they deployed and how they configured the directory service. So I'm going to go talk to my Active Directory administrator because he or she will know exactly how Active Directory is configured. The first question we ask you is to give us the IP address or FQDN to point to where Active Directory is. That's pretty straightforward. Again, you could probably guess this. In our training lab environment, we have Active Directory running on our domain controller machine. In your environment, the name of the machine may be something completely different. So talk to your Active Directory administrator. While you're talking to them, ask them whether or not they are encrypting the Active Directory traffic. Then the next thing that you need to figure out is the base DN. DN here stands for distinguished name. And as I promised, I'm going to tell you how I would guess the answer to that particular question. If I was working for a company and that company's name was something like acme.com, then I would assume that my base DN would be DC equal acme, comma, DC equal com. If this is my DNS domain name, then this is my Active Directory base DN. Actually, it doesn't have to be that, but chances are when they deployed Active Directory that they set the base DN as I just described. But I can't know that for certain without talking to the administrator. So ask the administrator. The next question that you're asked, or the pair of questions, is the credentials for vRealize operations to use when connecting to Active Directory. So the credentials are a username and a password. Here in our example, we're using a domain administrator, which is more powerful than you need to make this connection. And it's quite possible, if not likely, that your Active Directory administrator doesn't want you to connect using a domain administrator, but rather using some lesser account, like a service account. So again, if I were guessing, if I knew the password for the domain account, I could use that. But you should talk to your Active Directory administrator and ask them what account name should you tell vRealize operations to use. And while you're at it, ask them what the password is for that account. In the next section, one of the things that's asked is what port number are we using for Active Directory. If you are using Active Directory but you're not using encryption, by default, Active Directory uses port 389 for unencrypted Active Directory. On the other hand, the default for Active Directory when it's in secure mode is to use port number 636. Both of those port numbers are configurable. Again, if I could probably guess that your Active Directory is using encrypted and it is using port 636. But again, that's just a well-founded, educated guess. But to know the actual answer, you should talk to your Active Directory administrator. And then here's something you'll definitely want to talk to that admin about. In Active Directory, there are different ways of storing the user account objects. One method is known as SAM, which is you can see us referring to here. The other is called UPN. Now, this is not a full-blown class in Active Directory, so I'm not going to go into the detailed difference between them. But what you need to know at a minimum is whether your Active Directory environment was deployed using one or the other. Again, I could flip a coin. It's going to be one or the other, but you need to talk to the administrator to know for certain which mode you're using. vRealize operations needs to know which mode is being used because that is going to affect whether we can or cannot find the accounts that we're attempting to import. So that, in a nutshell, is how you create your LDAP import source. Once you've done that, now we can go and start importing Active Directory accounts into vRealize operations. Now that you have set up your LDAP import source, you can start importing LDAP users into vRealize operations. Again, continue with our example of an Active Directory set of users. What we would do is go to the same access control page that we went to before. You'll recall that access control page was where we went to the user accounts tab to add a new local user. When you're importing LDAP users, you go to the same tab, but you do not click the add button. Instead, you click ... and choose import from source. So you add a local user. On the other hand, you import an Active Directory user. In both cases, we're going to the same tab, but you need to go to different places from there. All right, so if we say we want to import a user or users from our directory service, the first thing that we're going to be asked to do is, actually before I tell you what you're going to be asked, look at this interface. Take a step back. Looky here. Step 1, Step 2. Just like when we were adding a local user, where we had 2 steps, we've got 2 steps here. And these 2 steps, while a little bit different, they're very similar to what you saw with local users. So in step number 1, we're going to import the users. To do so, you pick the LDAP import source that you just configured. And once again, you can choose basic or advanced depending upon how fancy you want your import search to be. In this case, we're just going to say basic. So all it asks is, please type a portion of the user's name. When you type a portion of the name and click search, it'll give you a list of all the account names that match what you typed. And to import that one user or multiple users, you just check the checkbox for each of the users that you want to import into vRealize operations. And then you click the next button. That will take you from step 1 to step 2. In step 2, we have the same sorts of tabs that we saw before. Again, you can assign what groups you want this LDAP user, what local groups you want this LDAP user to be a member of, and you can select what objects you want this imported LDAP user to have access to. If you would like to, hit the pause button and take a look at this interface, but by now, you should recognize every element of this user interface down here. It's exactly like what you saw for adding a local user, adding a local group. It's exactly the same down here for importing a user. Now that you know how to import an LDAP user, let's take a look at how to import an LDAP group. Well, the process is very similar to what we've seen before. Just like importing a local user, you need to first have set up your LDAP import source. We already know how to do that. Once you've done that, you can import any of the groups from Active Directory. You can assign roles to those groups, and you can associate objects with those groups. Let's take a look at some screenshots to see exactly what it looks like when you do this. The first thing you're going to do is go to Access Control. You'll go to the User Groups tab. Again, if you went to User Groups and clicked on the Add button, that would allow you to define a local group. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to import a group from Active Directory. So we're going to go to the ... We're still going to go to the User Groups tab, but we're going to go to ... choose Import from Source, because we're importing an LDAP group. And then the interface, the wizard that pops up, by now should be self-explanatory. So in step number 1, you're going to pick which import source. For instance, here we're picking our Active Directory import source that we created. Again, we've got a basic or advanced mode. But now what you're going to do is type a portion of the name of the group or groups that you want to import. And then you just check the checkbox or checkboxes for the group or groups that you want to import. Then you click Next, which will take us to step 2. And at this point, step 2 requires no explanation at all. You just simply say what role you want to assign the user. Don't forget to check this checkbox. And then you have seen this object access section so many times before that I'm not going to bother telling you how this part works again. If you don't know how this part works, just rewind the video, because we've talked about this section multiple times. It works the same way here as it did for the other types of accounts and groups. One more thing to mention. You can define your own vRealize operations roles. We already know that there are 4 roles that exist out of the box: administrator, power user, content admin, and read-only. But if you want to create your own roles, the place you do that is, once again, you go to Access Control, go to the Roles tab, and you can either open up the roles that already exist, see how they're defined, perhaps copy one and modify your copy, or if you want to create a brand new role, you click Add. Now, I don't have a screenshot to show you this, but you're going to see this in the lab that you're just about to do. When you say add a role, it's going to ask you to pick a name for that role, and then it's going to allow you to select which privileges you want that role to bestow upon users and groups that that role is assigned to. Again, you're going to get to see that in the lab time coming right up. We have a pair of labs for you to work on now. In this first lab, you're going to be working with local users and local groups. In the second lab, you're going to be working with LDAP users, which means you're going to need to create a connection to Active Directory. As a quick reminder, in our training lab environment, our Active Directory services are running on a machine called dc.vclass.local. That happens to be our domain controller. All the other answers that you'll need to create the connection between vRealize operations and Active Directory for our training lab environment, all the answers that you need are in your lab book. So let's go do these two labs, and when you're done, join me in the next video and we'll do a recap on this lesson. Now that we're done with this lesson, let's do a quick recap. We started off by talking about the difference between authentication and authorization. We showed you how authentication works and how we assign what users are authorized to do using role assignments. We talked about how vRealize operations handle situations where a user has multiple roles. Again, a user who belongs to multiple groups may have multiple roles because the groups have different roles. In other computing environments, they operate on the principle of least access, but that's not the case for vRealize operations. For vRealize operations, if you have a user that has multiple roles, then that user is going to get the combined power of all the privileges in both of the roles. We talked about how to create or how to add new local users and local groups. And then we talked about how to import existing users from Active Directory, also Active Directory groups, which again, in our example, was for Active Directory, but you could translate the techniques we showed you for Active Directory for other types of authentication systems, such as OpenLDAP. This brings us to the end of this module. If you'd like to, you can hit pause and review these key points. When you're done, join me in the next video and we'll get started on our next module. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to extend the capabilities of vRealize operations, and we're going to talk about ongoing management tasks that you will be performing. Management packs allow you to extend the capabilities of vRealize operations. Out of the box, vRealize operations understands how to monitor things such as vCenter servers, and vRealize operations knows how to monitor itself out of the box. But you can add additional management packs to extend the reach of what vRealize operations can manage. We have two lessons in this module. In the first lesson, we're going to talk about those management packs. And then in the second lesson, we're going to talk about ongoing maintenance tasks that you'll be performing to keep vRealize operations up and running. In this first lesson, we are going to discuss management packs. We're going to be talking about the most common management packs, and additionally, we'll show you how to download additional management packs from something known as the VMware Marketplace. Additionally, we'll talk about what to do with those management packs. Once you've downloaded them, we're going to show you how to install them and how to configure them. Out of the box, vRealize operations can monitor systems such as vCenter server systems, vSAN, and others. But you can extend the capabilities of vRealize operations so that it can monitor more of your IT environment. To get a feel for the types of things that vRealize operations can monitor, go to the integration section, which you can see displayed here on the screen. As you can see here, we have a repository of different types of systems that you can connect to. In addition to what you see here, you can go to a site known as the Marketplace to download additional management packs, which enable vRealize operations to monitor even more types of systems. But just taking a look at the list of representative samples here on the screen, vRealize operations can monitor your vCenter servers. It can monitor vSAN if you're using our virtualized storage technology. We can monitor vRealize Network Insight, vRealize Operations can monitor vRealize Log Insight, vRealize Automation, VMware Cloud on AWS, and the list goes on and on and on. So we have lots of different VMware products that we can monitor, plus other more generic technologies such as the service discovery technology we talked about earlier in the course. The ping adapter allows vRealize Operations to test to see whether services are available on the network by pinging. We have NSX-T support. Tell you what, hit the pause button and take a look at all these different possible things that you can connect to. Management packs allow vRealize Operations to connect to and monitor all sorts of different types of systems in your IT environment. Some of the management packs are built into vRealize Operations. For example, the vSphere management pack and the vSAN management packs are built in. Other management packs are available from VMware. They're not built into vRealize Operations, but they are available, such as the SDDC Health Monitoring Solution. Third-party companies such as Dell and others have management packs for their own hardware and software systems. For example, the Dell EMC PowerFlex Management Pack is available for vRealize Operations. Now, obviously, the management packs that are built into vRealize Operations are there and ready for you to use, but for any management packs that are not already installed into vRealize Operations, you can go investigate what other ones are available by going to marketplace.vmware.com. That's VMware's clearinghouse for add-on software to enhance all sorts of VMware products. So marketplace.vmware.com has management packs for enhancing vRealize Operations, plus the marketplace has add-ons for other products from VMware. But for our purposes right now, we're interested in the fact that the marketplace has management packs that you can download to install into vRealize Operations. When you download a management pack, it comes as a file called something.pak, and we will learn here shortly how to install those .pak files. When you install a management pack, many of them need you to create a connection to the monitored system by creating what's known as a cloud account. To see the different cloud accounts that are available, if you go to Data Sources Integrations, you'll see a list of all the cloud accounts that you've already created. Typically, right after deploying vRealize Operations, a cloud account for vCenter is created. But any other cloud accounts that you've already created will be listed here. If you'd like to see additional types of cloud accounts you can create, you can hit the Add Account button. The very first question we're going to ask you is what type of cloud account you want to create. Here's a list of the cloud account types. So there's a vCenter cloud account type. That's what enables vRealize Operations to connect to your vCenter server in order to monitor whatever that vCenter server is managing. If you have multiple vCenter servers, you would need to have multiple vCenter cloud accounts in vRealize Operations, one per vCenter server that you want to manage, or monitor, I should say. The VMware Cloud on AWS cloud account connects to VMware's cloud, public cloud partnership with AWS. We also have a cloud account that connects directly to native AWS and Microsoft Azure and NSX-T. Again, if you hit the pause button, you can take a look at all the different types of cloud accounts that you can create. Let's take a look at what it looks like when you create a cloud account. In this example, we're creating a cloud account that's going to connect vRealize Operations to vCenter. When you create a cloud account, regardless which of those types you're creating, the first thing you're going to tell us is the name that you want this cloud account to be called. You're very likely going to have multiple cloud accounts, so giving each one a unique name and description will help you and your colleagues to distinguish one cloud account from another. In this interface, we can configure not just the vCenter cloud account, but we can also, at the same time, configure a connection to vSAN, if you're using that technology, and service discovery, which we talked about earlier in the course. Under Connect to vCenter, your job is to supply the IP address or FQDN of your vCenter server that you want vRealize Operations to monitor. Then you need to supply us the credentials that vRealize Operations can use when connecting to that vCenter server. In the world of vRealize Operations, the data adapters run within a collector. You can actually run the same data adapter in multiple collectors. In fact, you could run the same data adapter in all your data collectors if you wanted to. But there are times when you have to be specific exactly which data collector you want the data adapter to run in. So if that's necessary, you can specify that here for under collector/group. After having supplied that information, it'd be a great idea to test to confirm that vRealize operations can talk to that vCenter server. So click this button here. And that's the basics of what you need to specify. But as you can see, there's more information you can supply. If you go to this checkbox here, you can enable or disable the actions that we discussed earlier when we talked about alerts. Remember, alerts have recommendations, and those recommendations can have actions. You can disable or enable those actions as you see fit. Under advanced settings, which we see displayed over here, there are a bunch of settings that are specific to vCenter. For instance, you can say whether or not you want vRealize operations to automatically discover new objects that are added to your vCenter server. Yes or no. You can say whether or not you want vRealize operations to pay attention to the change events that are occurring in vCenter server. You can say whether or not you want vRealize operations to pay attention to the distributed virtual switches that are being used in vCenter, along with whether or not you want to collect information about the distributed port groups. You can say whether or not you want vRealize operations to pay attention to the virtual machine folders in vCenter. You can set a maximum number of virtual machines that vRealize operations is monitoring. You can specify whether or not you want vRealize operations to provide the data needed by predictive DRS. vSphere predictive DRS is a feature that combines the knowledge of vRealize operations with the power of vSphere DRS. When you turn on this feature, vRealize operations will provide a proactive notification to DRS that it should move virtual machines around, whereas DRS ordinarily behaves by monitoring the current state of your cluster and migrating virtual machines around to deal with current performance issues. With vSphere predictive DRS, we take the knowledge based on all the information that vRealize operations is gathering. vRealize operations knows what your usage patterns are. So if vRealize operations knows that we're about to enter a period of time in which your environment typically starts suffering performance issues, predictive DRS allows vRealize operations to tell DRS to go ahead and proactively migrate virtual machines so that we can avoid the performance issues that we've seen previously. Again, vRealize operations is monitoring your environment every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. It knows what the patterns are. Enable actions, again, allows you to enable or disable actions. Cloud type has 3 choices. You can, when creating a vCenter connection, you can choose private cloud for your on-prem private data center vCenter server, or perhaps you're using a hosted private cloud that uses vCenter, or perhaps you're using VMware Cloud on AWS. So whichever of the 3 you're using for this particular vCenter server, just tell us which. Each vCenter server has a unique ID. This field will be filled out automatically once we discover the ID from vCenter. vCenter, by default, is going to collect information about guest file system usage. This field here allows you to say, but I don't want to collect that information for systems that have a name that matches this. And then the final 2 questions here have to do with what's known as a registration user. The registration user is used in situations where you do not want to plug in a full-blown administrator account for the credentials for this cloud account. Again, if we're sensitive about security, we don't potentially want the vCenter data adapter continually connecting to vSphere using administrator credentials. So what the registration user account allows you to do is to initially supply admin credentials vRealize operations will use those administration credentials to make the initial connection. And then from then on out, after we've got everything set up, we'll no longer use the administrator credentials. Instead, we'll use whatever credentials you specify over here. Again, vRealize operations by default needs, at least initially, needs to have access to administrative credentials. That's what the registration user is all about. The repository page will let you know all the different types of integrations we can do. And additionally, as you can see in this screenshot, it will inform you of any cloud accounts that you've created for each of these types of integrations. If you've never created a cloud account, you can do so by clicking Add Account. Again, exactly which of these integrations you use depends upon what you want to monitor in your IT infrastructure. When you download a management pack, sometimes called solutions, you essentially get two things. Each management pack will contain one or more data adapters that teaches vRealize operations how to monitor another type of system in your IT infrastructure. So a management pack will have at least one data adapter. That will allow us to collect the raw data from that external system. But raw data alone, while interesting, isn't particularly useful. We want the information to be useful. So each management pack will additionally include various types of content, such as dashboards, reports, alerts, symptoms, policies, and so forth, to provide you the ability to make that raw data more actionable. Again, instead of just displaying a bunch of raw data and or forcing you to analyze that data, we have all these different types of content to help you make sense of what that data is telling you. When installing management packs, here's some things to think about. First bullet item points out that you should check to make certain that the management pack that you're installing is supported for the specific version of vRealize operations that you're using. Again, you can check the VMware compatibility guide for that information. When installing a management pack, you need the management pack file. The management packs come in a file called something.pak. The file extension is .pak. So you'll go to marketplace.vmware.com to download the management pack.pak file, and then you'll upload that file into vRealize operations. Additionally, after you've installed the management pack, most management packs require some sort of configuration. For example, creating a data adapter instance before you can actually use the new management pack. As we've mentioned before, you can download the management pack.pak files from marketplace.vmware.com. As we've mentioned before, this site is a clearinghouse for add-on software to enhance all sorts of different VMware products. vRealize operations management packs are just one type of software that you can download from this site. As you browse the management packs on marketplace.vmware.com, you will have the ability to download the .pak files. However, be aware that in some instances, before you see the download button, there will be a login button. In order to download certain management packs, you must first authenticate with VMware using your my.vmware.com credentials. The credentials that you supply determine what software you can download. So you might need to find out from your colleagues who has the credentials for my.vmware.com. Your company has an account for my.vmware.com that has the privileges necessary to download these management packs. Again, find your colleague who knows the credentials to my.vmware.com for your company or organization. Once you've downloaded the .pak file for a management pack, you can install it by going to the integration section, clicking on the repository tab, and clicking on Add. When you click Add to add your management pack, there's a three-step wizard. In step number 1, you are going to browse to the .pak file that you downloaded. So browse to the .pak file. You then need to click the Upload button to upload that management pack file into vRealize operations. There are 2 additional checkboxes here, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the basic flow is you browse to your .pack file, you upload the .pack file, then on the next screen, you accept the end user license agreement, and on the third and final screen, it will install the management pack. Now again, there are these 2 checkboxes that allow you to slightly tweak how the management pack gets installed. The first checkbox allows you to say, if I've already installed this management pack, I would like you to go ahead and install this .pack file on top of that. The second checkbox allows you to say, if we are reinstalling the management pack, do or don't preserve any changes that you have previously made to the content of that management pack. This table here provides you an overview of the steps we just described. Again, in the first step, you're going to browse to the .pack file and upload it. In step 2, you're going to accept the end user license agreement. And in step 3, you're going to kick off the installation process. At which point, you might think that you're done. But remember, installing the management pack is not the end of the tasks that you need to perform. You still need to configure the management pack. When you click install in step number 3, you'll be shown a description of what's happening during the installation so that you can see the progress that's being made. And if there should happen to be any errors, this is where you will be able to see them. Now that you know how to install a management pack, let's talk about some of the most commonly used management packs. One of the management packs is called the vSAN solution. That's actually built into vRealize operations, so you do not need to download its .pack file. The vSAN solution is configured in conjunction with the vCenter Cloud account that you have presumably already created. Again, earlier we described how to create a vCenter Cloud account. All of the questions that we answered to connect to a vCenter server were done here on the vCenter tab. The vSAN tab allows you to provide information about your vSAN configuration, assuming you're using VMware's vSAN storage virtualization technology. So if you are using vSAN, for example, if you're using vSAN and the vSAN credentials are different than the vCenter credentials, you can check the first checkbox here to indicate how you have configured the accounts for vSAN. Again, all the vSAN related questions are answered here on this tab. Another common management pack is the SDDC Management Health Solution. In order to understand what this management pack is about, you first need to understand what SDDC is. SDDC stands for Software Defined Data Center. That is a collection of products from VMware that our customers use to deploy modern, highly automated, policy-driven, governance-based data centers. SDDC products include vCenter, ESXi, vRealize Operations, vRealize Automation, and other such products. The purpose of the SDDC Management Health Solution is to provide a single interface through which you can monitor the status of each of those different products. So you can see the overall status of all those products, and additionally you can drill down into each of the individual products to see what is occurring. If there are problems with any of the products, the SDDC Management Health Solution has alerts defined to enable you to quickly detect and remedy any problems that are occurring in the SDDC product suite. The vRealize True Visibility Suite extends the capabilities of vRealize operations beyond the usual vSphere virtual machine sort of monitoring that we've done so far in this course. So as you can see from the diagram, the True Visibility Suite has visibility into databases, into your compute infrastructure, into your storage, into your networking. It can view virtual machines, containers. Again, the idea here being to provide a single interface through which you can see the broad swath of your infrastructure. Instead of having vRealize operations focused on vSphere almost exclusively, you could open up the visibility, open up the scope, and see a broader swath of your infrastructure using the vRealize True Visibility Suite. Once you install management packs and configure their cloud accounts, it's important to make certain that the connection is actually functioning, that the data collectors are actually collecting data. You can confirm that by going to the integration screen, clicking on Accounts, and in the list of all your different cloud accounts, for example, here we see our vCenter server called VRops Cloud. In that list of all your cloud accounts, each cloud account has an icon in the status column to indicate whether or not the data adapter is functioning properly. In this example here, we can see that our vCenter connection is okay. If the status is not okay, that's an indication that something's going wrong with data collection, and that you should troubleshoot and remedy whatever the problem may be. If you should ever decide to remove a management pack, you can do so easily by going to Integrations, click the Repository tab, find the management pack that you no longer need, click its vertical ellipse button, the ... button, and choose Uninstall. Now that we know about management packs, let's do some lab work. In this lab, you are going to be installing and configuring two different management packs. The first is the Ping management pack, and the second is the SDDC management pack. Now that you're done with the lab, let's do a quick recap of the lesson. In this lesson, we talked about management packs, we talked about some of the most commonly used management packs, and additionally, we let you know where you can go to get more management packs, marketplace.vmware.com. Then we taught you how to install and configure management packs. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the various maintenance tasks that you'll be performing on your vRealize operations cluster. In this lesson, we'll talk about how to monitor the health of your cluster. We'll talk about how to generate a support bundle. We'll see how to examine the log files and audit reports. And additionally, we'll take a look at various management tasks for the cluster itself. There are log files for all the different subsystems within vRealize operations. You can see those log files either going through the product UI or the admin UI. In both cases, you can see the log files either by going to the Logs tab or by going to Support Logs. And when you're in there, you will see an entry for every single node. In this screenshot here, there is only one node. This is apparently a single node cluster. If you had more nodes, you would have additional top-level folders in this list. Each of those folders will contain a folder, a subfolder, for each of the different major subsystems within vRealize operations. Each of these subfolders contains the log files that you need in order to troubleshoot issues going on with any of these subsystems. In addition to the log files, which you can view through this interface, another way of viewing the same log files is to make use of VMware's product called VMware vRealize Log Insight. That is a product from VMware that will take log files such as these from vRealize operations and log files from other VMware products and aggregate them together in a central location so that you now can look at all the log files from within one interface. Additionally, vRealize Log Insight provides analytical tools to help you make sense of what those log files are trying to tell you. If you've not used VMware vRealize Log Insight, you can take a free tour by going to labs.hol.vmware.com. In the upper right-hand corner, where there's the login link, you can additionally click register if you do not already have your free account. When you log into your account, if you search for Log Insight, you'll find several different hands-on labs that will take you on a tour of the features and capabilities of Log Insight. Again, the hands-on labs are a free resource that are available 24 hours a day. If you've not already been there, go to labs.hol.vmware.com. support.hol.vmware.com. Many VMware products enable you to generate something called a support bundle. Typically, the time you'll use support bundles is when you contact our support personnel and they instruct you to create a support bundle. So what are these? Support bundles allow our products to generate a single file that you can send to our support personnel. That single file contains information designed to assist them in troubleshooting whatever problem you may be experiencing with our products. So those support bundles, exactly what's in them depends upon the product, but support bundles typically contain things such as log files, configuration files, and other such information that can assist us in troubleshooting whatever problem you may be reporting. So in vRealize Operations, you can create these support bundles. Let's take a look at the interface that you use to create them. Here you can see we are in the product UI. You can also do the same thing in the admin UI, but these screenshots are of the product UI. As you can see, we've gone to Administration, Support Bundles, and by clicking Add, we launch the Generate Support Bundles wizard. That wizard has two questions it asks you. One is, would you like to create a light bundle or a full bundle? A light bundle only includes 24 hours worth of log file entries. On the other hand, a full bundle includes the full logs. The other question that you're asked down on the bottom is which nodes in your vRealize operations cluster, which nodes do you want to include in the support bundle? In this particular screenshot, there is only one node listed because this apparently is a single node cluster. But in a multi-node cluster, you would see each of the nodes listed. There's a checkbox next to each node, and you can use that checkbox to indicate which nodes you do and don't want included in your support bundle. The audit page in the product UI provides you access to 4 different audit reports. The system audit report tells you how many objects vRealize Operations is monitoring, how many data adapters it's running, how many metrics it's collecting. One place that information is useful is if you are recalculating the size of your vRealize Operations nodes. Understanding how many objects and how many metrics is a key indicator or key determinant of what size node you deploy. The permissions audit provides a report about the users, what roles they're accessed, what groups they're in, what permissions they have. The activity report gives you an audit trail of what users are doing in vRealize Operations. So it gives you a time-stamped entry for every task that they're performing. And the system component audit provides you with a list of the different components. So things such as which version of vRealize Operations, what management packs do you have installed, what versions, so that you have a succinct summary of exactly what components you have in your vRealize Operations cluster. The recent tasks screen allows you to see information about tasks that are being performed in vRealize Operations. You can see which tasks are running, you can see what state they're in, you can see whether a task has completed. If it's completed, you can see whether it completed successfully or it failed. Again, all of this information and more is available in the recent tasks screen. The product UI allows you to see information about your vRealize Operations cluster. For instance, you can see whether or not the cluster is online or offline. You can see whether or not high availability and continuous availability are enabled or disabled. You'll see a list of each node in your cluster along with accompanying information about those nodes. And on the bottom of the screen, you will see information about the data adapters being used by each of those nodes. Now, one thing to understand here is that the product UI allows you to see this type of information about your cluster. However, the product UI does not allow you to manage the cluster. If you want to actually manage the cluster, you need to go to the admin UI. The product UI allows you to see what's going on in your cluster. But in order to manage the cluster, you need to go into the admin UI. The admin UI will both let you see what's going on in your cluster in vRealize operations, and the admin UI will allow you to manage the cluster. So in the admin UI, in the system status section, you can not only see whether the cluster is online, offline, not only can you see whether HA and CA are enabled or disabled, you can actually manage those. You can take the entire cluster offline or bring it back online. You can take an individual node online or offline. You can enable or disable HA or continuous availability. You can apply software updates, and additionally, you can turn on or turn off the SSH server on each individual node. If you'd like to enable or disable SSH on a particular node, in the system status screen, find the node in the list of nodes, find the node that you want to configure for SSH, and over on the right side of that node's line, there's a simple slider switch that you can either slide to the right to enable the SSH server in the node, or slide to the left to disable the SSH server. In the following slides, we're going to talk about several different maintenance tasks that you'll perform in your vRealize operations cluster. As you can see, we're going to be talking about backups and restores. We're going to talk about how to add resources to your vRealize operations cluster. We'll talk about how to change IP addresses for nodes, and not just nodes in general, but specifically how to change the IP address of your primary node if you ever need to do so. This slide essentially is designed to make 2 points. One is that you can use essentially any backup solution that you want. There are lots of third-party backup solutions available. We recommend that you use one that takes advantage of VMware's vSphere storage APIs for data protection. That's an API that the third-party backup vendors can choose to use that enhances their backups by providing additional functionality, such as the ability to take snapshots of the machines before we back them up. Additionally, using the API, they can perform off-host backups, which aids in the overall performance of VMs in your environment while backups are taking place. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The second thing to be aware of is that when you perform a backup or you perform a restore, you need to back up the entire cluster. Or conversely, when you restore, you need to restore the entire cluster. As you'll recall, vRealize Operations is a cluster technology built on top of GEMFire. And GEMFire, one of the assumptions of GEMFire is, one of the requirements of GEMFire is that you have to back up all the nodes. And when it comes time to restore, you need to restore all the nodes. So again, use whichever backup solution is appropriate in your environment, but make certain that you back up the entire vRealize operations cluster, all the nodes in there. And if you ever need to do a restore, remember, do not restore a single node. You must restore all the nodes in the cluster. Early on in this course, we talked about how to pick the size of your vRealize operations nodes. There were extra small nodes, there were small nodes, medium, large, extra large, and ideally, the decision that you make initially will last you forevermore. But situations change, conditions change, and at times, our customers need to revisit how they size their vRealize operations nodes, specifically the nodes in the analytics cluster. When that sort of situation arises, you can either scale up or scale out. When we talk about scaling up, what we mean is, in order to give your vRealize operations cluster more resources, you can scale up by adding more resources to the vRealize operations nodes that you already have. So scale up takes the nodes you already have and just makes them bigger. When you change the size of a vRealize operations node, you must change the size of the nodes equally. So the overall process is, you will need to take the cluster offline. You've seen in previous slides where you can take the cluster offline. You will need to power off the nodes. At that point, you can use the vSphere client to increase the amount of CPU resources, memory resources, and storage resources in each of the nodes. But remember, because we're using GEMFire, because of assumptions that GEMFire makes, you must size each of the nodes equally. They each need to have the same number of virtual CPUs, the same amount of memory, same amount of storage space. Once you've evenly sized up each of the nodes, you can power on the nodes and bring the cluster back online. Now your vRealize operations cluster has more capacity to analyze your larger environment. The other approach is to scale out. When we talk about scaling out, what we mean is to add more vRealize operations nodes to your vRealize operations cluster. Now, doing so, you've already seen in the beginning of the class how to deploy a node. So it's the same process that we saw earlier. Just be aware that if you choose to scale out your cluster, that scaling out requires what's known as a rebalance operation. Now that you have this new node and it has its own storage space, the cluster wants to rebalance how it has partitioned the data across the storage in the nodes in the cluster. Again, the rebalance operation does take time. However, during that time, vRealize operation is still functional, but it does take time to do the rebalance. Regardless whether you choose to scale up or scale out, remember that all the nodes in your analytics cluster need to be the same size. At times, it might be necessary to change the IP address of one of your vRealize operations nodes. So we're going to talk about how to do that, but please be aware that in the next slide, we're going to tackle the specific case of changing the IP address on the primary. So this procedure here is not for the primary, it's for the other nodes in your cluster. If you need to change the IP address of a non-primary node, you take the node offline. So that means go into the admin UI, go to system status and take the node offline. At that point, you can shut down the node, modify its IP address, power the node back on, and bring the node back online. Again, this is the process for changing the IP address on non-primary nodes. On the other hand, if you want to change the IP address of the primary node, the process is similar, but it's more involved. Step one is you need to take all the non-primary nodes offline. The reason why we're doing that is in step two, if you want to take the primary node offline, the other nodes have to already be offline. So you take the non-primaries offline. Again, to do that, you would go into the admin UI, go to system status, take the non-primaries offline, then take the primary offline. At that point, you can shut down the primary. You don't have to shut down the others, but shut down the primary, change its IP address, and here in step number 5, we're suggesting that you update DNS with this new IP address information. That's actually something you should do. On the previous slide, perhaps we should have listed this same step. Updating DNS is useful whether you're changing the IP address of the primary or non-primaries. So update DNS so that it knows the new IP address, then power on the primary, bring the primary online, then you can bring all the other nodes online. Again, the process is a bit more involved when it's the primary node, but essentially it boils down to largely the same steps. If you're running an older version of vRealize operations, for example, vRealize Operation 7.4, you can upgrade from older versions of vRealize operations to newer versions. If you plan to do that upgrade, one of the recommendations that we make is that you take a snapshot of every node in the cluster. That way, if the upgrade should fail for some reason, you can easily and quickly restore the functionality of vRealize operations by simply deleting the snapshot. Now, in addition to that recommendation, we also have another recommendation that involves something called the pre-upgrade readiness assessment tool, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. VMware supplies the pre-upgrade readiness assessment tool. This is a tool that customers use when they're upgrading from older versions of vRealize operations, vRealize Operation 7, to vRealize Operations 8. When vRealize Operations is upgraded from release to release, at times VMware may discontinue or disable certain features, such as specific metrics. What this assessment tool allows you to do is to be made aware before you actually perform the upgrade. This tool will make you aware of any such issues, and it will make recommendations how to address those issues. So let's take a look at how you download and use this tool. To use this tool, you first need to download it. In step number 1 here on the screen, you can see the location you would go to download the .pak file for this tool. That's right, this tool comes as a .pak file, just like a management pack. And just like a management pack, the way you install the assessment tool is the same way you install a management pack. It's just a .pak file, you upload the .pak file and install it. As a side effect of doing that, that's going to run the readiness assessment tool, which will generate a zip file. You'll save that zip file locally. And when you open up that zip file, one of the things that you'll find in there is the pre-upgrade readiness assessment report. And that's where you're going to go to find out what, if any, issues there are in the upgrade for you. Again, you may have dashboards or reports or other such things using metrics that we've discontinued. This report will help you to identify those and guide you how to modify your dashboards or other content to take into consideration the fact that something has been changed in the newer version of vRealize operations. Okay, let's take our knowledge and put it into action here in this lab. In this lab, you're going to be monitoring the health of your vRealize operations cluster. You're going to be generating a support bundle. You'll get to take a look at the log files. And additionally, we're going to show you how to create the pre-upgrade assessment report. Let's recap this lesson. In this lesson, we talked about how to monitor the health of your vRealize operation cluster. We talked about how to generate a support bundle. We saw how to view the log files and the audit reports. And additionally, we talked about various management tasks that you'll perform on your cluster. This brings us to the end of another module. If you'd like to, you can hit the pause button to review these key points.